Happy Sabbath, and welcome to One Place. Well, what a pleasure to be back together in live service, to be able to be together here after all these weeks and months of having to isolate. Oh, it feels good. It feels good to be here. And for those of you who are watching online on our YouTube or Facebook, we welcome you as well. It's a pleasure to have you here. There are a couple places on this campus where it's allowed to speak without a mask, and this is one of them. I've got glasses, and I'm fogging up, so if you don't mind, I'm going to take it off so I can see. and I'll put it back on right after the service. So, well, here we are. We continue our journey through the book of Jeremiah, and it's a prophet of doom and gloom. I don't know how many of you have read the book or you've been following along, reading a few chapters every week. And it is one of those prophets that we don't read often, but the message is so relevant to our lives and to the life of God's people. This is a man who lived in a time when Judah and Jerusalem were going through some very hard times. It was not an easy ministry for Jeremiah to be a God spokesperson, to speak for God, and to give messages to the kings, to the people, to the priests, and to the kingdom. It was really, really hard. In fact, it was a real hardship. He experienced so many setbacks. He almost died a few times. People either loved him or hated him. A few kings really hated him and didn't want to be very close to him or to listen to what he had to say. During his lifetime, and he had a very long life, he served under 5 different kings of Judah and Israel. So a lot of turnover is happening here. All kinds of upheaval, murderous crowds, kings toppled and replaced. He lived through social unrest. That's the kind of life he lived there in Jerusalem. People lacked resources, lots of famines, lots of crime, lots of bloodshed. You name it, he saw it, he experienced it. That's the kind of life he lived as a prophet in Jerusalem, in Judah. And in the midst of all this chaos, he had a mission to serve God and speak to the people on behalf of God. To speak the truth to power is very often risky business, really risky. And so today we study one chapter among about 3 or 4, describing events and messages during this troubled time in the city of Jerusalem. It's a surprising message. It's an unusual message. We never thought that God could speak that way through a prophet. Listen, turn to Jeremiah chapter 7. So if you've got your Bibles, if you've got your iPhones, just turn it on, or watch it here on the screen behind me. Jeremiah chapter 7, and there we find a very, very unusual comment on the part of God to Jeremiah, or through Jeremiah. Listen to what he has to say. Let's go to verse 16, chapter 7, verse 16. So God says to Jeremiah, "So do not pray for this people, nor offer any plea or any petition for them. Don't plead with me." The New Living Translation says, "Don't beg with me." I'm reading from the NIV. "For I will not listen to you." Have mercy. God will not listen to our prayers, to the prayers of Jeremiah of all people. God will not listen to prayers. Now, any of you who've grown up in a Christian home, who's been to Sabbath school, when you were young, you were taught at a very young age this beautiful passage from the Gospel of Matthew, which says, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. As if to say, if you've got anything talk to God about it. If you've got any troubles, pray. Pray to God as to a friend. Open your heart. Just ask God, and God will listen to you. That's what we're taught, isn't it? When we go to church, when we're young, we're taught, have faith, believe in God, pray to God, listen. God will listen to you. Go ahead. Don't be afraid. That's a beautiful invitation to dialogue to God as to a friend. It's an invitation. You've got trouble, talk to God about it. But now, in this passage today, God shows a totally different take on this invitation, and he frankly says to Jeremiah, don't bother me talking to me about what Jerusalem and Judah needs. I don't want to hear about it. In fact, I'm not going to listen to you. What in the world is going on? What in the world is going on for God to have that kind of a change of attitude? Instead of inviting people, to be with him, to talk to him, that God would be so hostile toward his own people, the covenant people of Israel. Why would God be so hostile that he does not want to listen to the prayer of a good man on behalf of his people? I won't listen. Well, the context of this story happens around the year 609 BC. And we're going back a long time here. 2,600 and some years ago. We go back in time a long time. And that year alone, 609 BC, saw 3 different kings on the throne in Jerusalem. 3 different kings. Can you imagine? King Josiah, good King Josiah, unfortunately gets into his head that he should take his army and go fight against the Pharaoh of Egypt that is going through the country on his way north to attack the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And good King Josiah goes into a battle against Pharaoh Necho, and he dies. That's too bad. He was a good king, and he should have lived a whole lot longer. And so he dies, and Necho goes to Jerusalem, and he takes one of the sons of Josiah, Jehoahaz, and he places him as the king of Jerusalem. But after 3 months, Necho's fed up with this young man, kicks him out, takes him to Egypt in captivity, and that's where he dies. And so instead of that son, he takes the other son of Josiah, by the name of Jehoiakim, and he becomes the king of Jerusalem. We'll be there for about 11 years. So in the space of 5 months or so, you've got 3 different kings. Lots of uncertainty, lots of upheavals, lots of troubled times. That's the year that this is all going on here in chapter 7. And if anything was needed that year, it was more prayers, more intercessions, more communications with God, more listening to what God has to say. Yet God says to Jeremiah, don't pray to me about them. I'm not going to listen to you. Don't bother. Why not? What's going on, God? What's going on that you're not going to listen to any prayers in this such a rough time, in a time of trouble? Why is God so closed-minded toward his people? Well, chapter 7 tells us what is going on, and it's not a good story. Although the story happens more than 2,600 years ago, it's part of our sacred scriptures, it's part of our Bibles, so that says to us there's something we can learn from what's going on there. There's something for us, even though it's so long ago, some lessons that hopefully we will learn and not repeat. Would it not be an awful prospect to think that one day God would say to his people today, to any nation, don't pray to me about them, I don't want to hear about it, I'm not going to listen to you. What would make God say such a thing to somebody else today if the same conditions were to be repeated? Well, brace yourself here for some uncanny revelations and for a troublesome list of sins that made God say what he said through Jeremiah. Let's go back to the top of the chapter. chapter 7, verse 1. Let's go right to the top. There's a number of verses there that we can read. And I think just reading the story is going to help us get the context of why God is so hostile and upset and shutting himself off from listening to Jeremiah. Verse 1, I'm reading from the NIV. This is the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah. Stand at the gate of the Lord's house and there proclaim this message. Hear the word of the Lord, you, all of you people of Judah who come through these gates to worship the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, oh, this is the temple of the Lord. The temple of the Lord is here. This is the temple of the Lord. If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever. But look, you are trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods you have not known, and then come and stand before me in my house, which bears my name, and say, we're safe. Safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you? But I have been watching, declares the Lord. There you have it. There it is. Now we know what's troubling God. This message was not new. This kind of talk here was not new. For decades, various prophets had preached the same thing to the people of Judah and Jerusalem and Israel. In fact, these counsels and commands were as old as Moses. So that goes back a lot of years. But more recently, prophets like Amos and Micah and Habakkuk and Joel and Isaiah had all preached the same message and the same thing. It had been told over and over by various prophets for decades. As part of the covenant between God and Israel, there was a clear request that the people of God were to be a light to the world, an example to the nations around them. And the way to be such a light was to be different from the other people and obey the commandments of God, the 10 commandments. And did you notice a few of them are quoted here in this passage? A few of the 10 commandments are referred to. And all of the social implications that these commandments also had. If you obey the commandments of God, it has an impact on how you live your life in society. Many times, the people had transgressed these commandments. More and more prophets had come to remind them not to do that, to come back to the Lord. And now Jeremiah had to confront them one more time again. And they had done exactly what God had asked them not to do for decades, for generations. It's as if they don't care anymore about what God's will is for them. They've become complacent. They've become deceived into some false sense of security. And that sense of complacency and negligence manifested itself, in all kinds of social behavior, misbehavior. Not obeying God's commandments could be seen in how they treated one another, as we saw in the list of the commandments that are transgressed. They harassed the widows, the orphans, the strangers among them. They did not care anymore about social justice, human rights, decency, civility. It was to each his own. It was the survival of the strongest and the most powerful. The social fabric had disintegrated, so to speak. Gone were the social nets to take care of those who are less fortunate. But in the eyes of God, his people was to be a blessed nation only if they cared honestly for each other, if they had justice for all people, not only for the strong, the powerful, the mighty, the privileged. No, everybody is to be cared for equally. And so in verse 11, God could say through Jeremiah, I have been watching. I've been looking. I've been watching what's going on. And yes, God had been watching. And what he had seen was not pleasing him. And one more thing bothered God a great deal. And we saw it in verses 3 and 4. So I'll go back to those. This is what the Lord Almighty says, the God of Israel. Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of the Lord. Look, this is the temple. You know, the temple of the Lord. And think you're safe because the temple is there. When King Solomon had built this beautiful temple of God in Jerusalem, God had appeared during the dedication service. God had come down from heaven, had entered into the temple, and the temple had been flooded with the presence of God, light and smoke, and really something awesome had happened at that very moment, something spectacular about the presence of God at the moment of the dedication. It had made everyone confident of God's blessings upon the people, upon the nation, upon the city. They knew God would protect this building because God resides in the building. God had been there to bless the building. And ever since, people had said to themselves, repeating it generations after generations, for over 400 years by then, that this miracle of God's presence at the dedication of the temple meant that God would never, never allow the temple, this house of worship, to be destroyed. And so people felt protected. They felt protected. And they had become complacent, that they could do anything they wanted, disobey God, disregard the commands of God, the social implications of the commands of God. They could disregard everything because the temple was there. They'd be safe. To them it meant, that they would always be safe and nothing harmful would happen to them. And so that thinking had led to religious complacency and even false worship. They were worshiping Baal. They were worshiping the wife of Baal, Astarte, which is also a little later in this chapter called the Queen of Heaven. And so they were doing all kinds of false things, even sacrificing some of their children, human sacrifices, to some of these idols. They were doing that right there in Jerusalem, in the presence of God's temple. And so through Jeremiah, God was now telling them that enough is enough. That's it. God was saying to them, I've talked through Amos and Micah and Isaiah and all of these prophets. You're the last one. This is it. This is the end of the road. Yes, God loved his temple in Jerusalem. For sure he did. But he loved something else more than stones and bricks and wood. He loved his people acting and living like his people, obeying his commandments, taking care of the less fortunate. The real worship of Yahweh in his temple meant that people were safeguarding the character of God in their own lives, that they would live in a just society and refuse to worship other gods. They would reflect who God is. But now the temple had become some kind of amulet, some kind of superstitious charm that would prevent any harm, whatever they did. Well, that time and that thinking had come to an end. This is it. God would have no more of it. And so in verse 4, do not trust in deceptive words and say, this is the temple of God, we're safe. Within 25 years of this chapter, the temple is destroyed. And this time it is by King Nebuchadnezzar. We know him. It's the prophet Daniel and the stories of Daniel. This king happens to be there in Isaiah. We will see that king a little later in the book of Jeremiah, And we will see also that king in 1 Kings and 2 Kings and other places of the Bible. He will destroy this temple. And most of the people will die. And if they don't die, they're deported to Babylon. A few will stay in Jerusalem, and one of them is Jeremiah. And again, we'll see a little later in the semester. He is the prophet of doom and gloom. You can tell why now. A sobering message. A message about deception, a message about people being conned, a message about people being deceived. It's a deceived nationalism, in fact, that's what it is. A message about consequences, a message about accountability, and not understanding what's going on. Of course, this is a story of a nation that no longer exists. It's all gone a long time ago. It's the story of the religious death of a nation that deceived itself into thinking that because it had once been blessed by God, it would always be blessed by God. It's the story of a religious death leading to a national catastrophe and disappearance. No longer there. This message of Jeremiah seems to say that a people or a nation that claims to be blessed by God ought to live like God wants it to live, if it wants to go on being blessed by God. And as I've said, this is about a people and a nation a long, long, long time ago. But is it possible that today God would still think like this? That this would be the way God would think about people and about nations and about groups of people? Is it possible that today God would say to a people, to a nation, I'm sorry, don't pray anymore. I'm not listening to you. Wow. The book of Jeremiah seems to say, again, I'm going from Jeremiah, I'm jumping 2,600 years, I'm coming to today here. But the book of Jeremiah seems to say, and if we have it in the Bible, it's because we believe as Christians that it might have something to say for who we are today. So the book of Jeremiah seems to say that God will bless a people and a nation to the same extent that they will care for the less fortunate with social justice, equity, and fairness. No people, no nation is invincible, immortal, eternal. The end of any people or nation is possible. That's what the book of Jeremiah is saying. No sacred history, no great document or symbols of its glorious heritage, no gorgeous buildings can preserve a people or a nation from the consequences of practicing evil. That's the message of chapter 7, 8, 9, 10. It's a sobering message. Jeremiah is a prophet of doom and gloom, and I must say quite relevant for our time and for our nation that has claimed being blessed by God. Isn't that part of our American heritage? Isn't that what we learn in social studies and in history classes, and that's the way we understand ourselves in the history of the world and in the modern world? Will we listen and pay attention to that tragic story told in the book of Jeremiah? Will God say to us one day, don't bother praying, I'm not listening, and leave us to our own fate and destruction? Is that possible? Is that a scenario that's possible? The following chapters continue to expand on that story, and there's more prophecies and more words that are being said by Jeremiah. But at the end of chapter 9, so we'll skip a couple chapters. At the end of chapter 9, God offers a solution. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. Well, a lot of Jeremiah is doom and gloom. Probably 90% of it is doom and gloom. But sometimes there are a few little beacons of hope. And at the end of chapter 9, there's one of them. Right there in the midst of this whole story here. God offers the solution to prevent the doom that Jeremiah has predicted. So God will listen to prayers. This is where we find words of hope, and we should keep them in mind and let them sink into our hearts and our minds. Again, God reminds his people that what matters most for him and what makes a great nation and what must be done by a nation so God will listen to prayers. Our own nation, is still feeling a little unsettled over the last few weeks and the events that happened earlier this month, and perhaps even over the last 4 years. And we need words of hope to mark a direction to follow. Well, let me end by reading these solemn words. Chapter 9, 23-24. 23-24. This is what the Lord says. Let not the wise boast of their wisdom, or the strong boast of their strength, or the rich boast of their riches. But let one who boasts about this. You want the answer? Here it is. That they have the understanding to know me, that I am the Lord who exercises kindness, justice, and righteousness on earth, for in these things I delight, declares the Lord. These are the words of hope. They invite humility and also a non-pretentious spirit. These words are simple reminders of what matters most to God. Here is an invitation to us, to our nation, to think and to live in accordance with God's own character: kindness, justice, righteousness, fairness, for all people. Not only for the privileged or the rich or the people of one ethnic group, for all people. Simple words, a simple path to follow to be blessed, and as a nation to be heard by God. We live in a time when we want God to listen to our prayers on behalf of our nation and our leaders. God says there are conditions for these prayers to be heard, and here they are. Well, maybe the message of Jeremiah is for us today. If he were here, if Jeremiah were here on earth today and living in one of our big cities, what would he say to us? Maybe he would say, as people in Congress and in our various state legislatures work and pass laws signed by the president and by the governors, what matters is that these actions reflect these principles of kindness and justice and righteousness and fairness for all people. Anything less, God is not going to listen. He's watching. Maybe Jeremiah would say to us, God is watching you on social media. You pray and you want God to listen. Well, what about on social media? Kindness, justice, righteousness, and fairness. Well, this story, these words of God through Jeremiah, are really a message of love, really, from God. An ultimate message. Yes, it's framed within doom and gloom, but sometimes God has to shake our complacency to wake us up. Yes, it's a wake-up call, and I hope we don't push the snooze button. Amen.